Matt had been looking forward to this weekend for weeks. It wasn't often that he and his fellow summer camp counselors had the chance to unwind together away from the chaos of overseeing dozens of energetic campers. The idea of a weekend hiking trip had sounded perfect, peaceful, adventurous, and a chance to enjoy the dense forest without a watchful eye on a horde of teenagers. They had set off that morning with high spirits, a group of 6 ready to tackle the trails that surrounded the campgrounds. The plan had been straightforward. They would hike together until the main clearing, where the group would split into pairs, each setting off on different trails to explore. Matt's group included Carly and Ben, 2 of his closest friends among the counselors. Carly had always been the group's optimist, and Ben the joker who never took anything too seriously. The 3 had veered off to take the northern trail, leaving the others to check out the eastern side of the forest. The hike started well enough. Sunlight filtered through the trees, casting shifting patterns on the forest floor, as a cool breeze rustled the leaves above. They chatted as they walked, their laughter echoing in the woods. But it wasn't long before Matt noticed a change. The warmth of the sun seemed to dim slightly, and the birds that had filled the forest with chirping went quiet. Then came the whistle. It pierced through the silence like a blade, sharp and unsettling. It sounded human, almost melodic, but something about it made Matt's skin prickle. He exchanged a glance with Carly, her carefree demeanor now tinged with unease. Ben shrugged it off, calling out into the woods with a joking, "Hello, got any requests?" But when no one responded, he simply fell silent, his laughter fading. The group pressed on, trying to shake off the unsettling sound, but it returned again and again, sometimes close, sometimes impossibly far, each time causing them to halt and look around, scanning the trees for any sign of movement. The footsteps began shortly after, soft, almost imperceptible, over the crunch of twigs and dry leaves beneath their own boots. But there, a deliberate pace that seemed to mirror their own, always just a step behind. "This is getting creepy," Carly muttered after a while, her eyes darting from shadow to shadow. Ben tried to put on a brave face, but his constant joking had quieted, replaced with forced chuckles and strained reassurances. Matt felt a knot of unease growing in his gut. It didn't feel like they were alone anymore, and whoever was out there was toying with them. Then, without warning, Carly screamed. Matt spun around just in time to see her disappear between the trees. Pulled away so quickly it was almost as if she had vanished into thin air. Ben shouted her name, and Matt ran forward, his heart pounding as he tore through the brush, branches whipping at his face. But Carly was gone, and the only sound that met his ears was the echo of her fading scream. Panic gripped them. The cheerful hike had become a nightmare. They searched frantically, calling Carly's name until their throats were raw. But the forest, once so inviting, seemed to twist around them, endless rows of identical trees making them lose their sense of direction. And then, in the distance, the whistle came again. This time, it was mocking, as if whoever was out there knew just how terrified they were. "We have to get out of here," Matt hissed, grabbing Ben's arm. He could see the fear in his friend's eyes, the realization that something very wrong was happening here. They needed to leave, to find the others, and get help. But every path they tried seemed to lead them deeper into the woods, and the footsteps were growing closer, accompanied now by the sound of branches breaking, something heavy moving through the undergrowth. It was Ben who saw him first. The figure emerged from the shadows of the trees, tall, gaunt, with tangled hair and wild eyes. In his hand was an axe, the blade stained with rust and something else Matt didn't want to think about. The hermit moved with a grim purpose, his gaze locked on them, and for a moment, Matt felt paralyzed by fear. Then Ben shoved him, breaking the spell, and they turned and ran. They stumbled through the forest, branches clawing at their clothes, the ground uneven beneath their feet. Matt could hear Ben behind him, panting, his breaths labored, the footsteps of the hermit never far behind. The whistle came again, now so close it felt like it was inside Matt's head, and he knew they were running out of time. Ben stumbled, falling hard, and Matt skidded to a stop, turning back. He reached out, grabbing Ben by the arm and pulling him to his feet, adrenaline giving him strength. They could see the clearing now, just a few more feet. If they could make it there, they might have a chance. They burst into the clearing, the bright sunlight momentarily blinding after the darkness of the forest. Matt looked around wildly, trying to spot the others, but there was no sign of them. He pulled Ben forward toward the trail that led back to camp, hoping against hope that they could make it before the hermit caught up. The footsteps slowed, then stopped. Matt glanced back, and for a moment he saw the hermit standing at the edge of the clearing, watching them. His face twisted into a smile, and he raised the axe, the metal glinting in the sunlight before he turned and melted back into the shadows. Matt didn't stop running until they reached the campgrounds. By the time they did, his lungs were burning, his legs ready to give out. He collapsed onto the ground, Ben beside him, both of them gasping for air. Carly was still out there, somewhere in the forest, and Matt knew they had to get help, to go back for her. But even as the other counselors came running, their faces full of concern, Matt could still hear that whistle echoing in his mind, a haunting reminder that the forest was not as empty as they had once thought. Story 2. The sun was sinking low over the endless fields of golden wheat, the air heavy with the scent of sun-warmed earth and distant wildflowers. Emma sat in the passenger seat, her eyes glued to the view rolling past. The quiet hum of the car, a small breeze coming through the cracked window, and the sense of freedom made the world feel limitless. It was supposed to be an adventure, a summer road trip that would take her and her 3 closest friends through America's vast countryside, from charming little towns to stunning scenic spots they had only seen in photographs. They were driving through the Midwest, and it was on this particular day, somewhere between nowhere and anywhere, that they came upon a small sign, "Welcome to Willow's End, Annual Harvest Festival today." Emma's friend Nate, who was at the wheel, glanced at her with a grin. "Harvest Festival, huh? Sounds like fun," he said, his eyes catching the excitement of the other passengers. Behind them, Abby and Tyler exchanged knowing smiles. They were all looking for that sense of adventure, the kind that only seemed to happen in these hidden little corners of the country. As they entered the town, Willow's End seemed to have emerged from another time, untouched by the outside world. Quaint white houses lined the main street, and all around, people bustled about preparing for the festival. Handmade banners were strung up between the streetlights. Children in simple clothing ran barefoot on the grass, and smiling faces turned to wave as the group drove by. The people seemed too friendly, too welcoming, but no one really paid much mind to it. The allure of the small-town charm was infectious. When they parked by a small general store, they were immediately approached by an elderly man. He introduced himself as Mr. Calloway, the Harvest Festival organizer, and he radiated warmth as he invited them to join the festivities that evening. "We love guests. You'll find no better hospitality than here in Willow's End," he said, his voice roughened with age but holding an inviting tone. Emma felt a prickle of unease, a sense that something was slightly off, but Abby nudged her with a grin. "Come on, this is exactly what we came out here for. Something different," she said. The others agreed, and soon they were being shown to one of the barns that had been turned into a makeshift guest house. Night fell, and the Harvest Festival began in earnest. The townspeople gathered in the town square, lit with lanterns that flickered like fireflies in the dusk. Folk music played from a small stage, and tables were laden with fresh bread, jams, and bottles of amber liquid. There was laughter, dancing, and a sense of community so thick it almost seemed intoxicating. Emma danced with Tyler, and as she spun, she saw Mr. Calloway watching them. His eyes were dark, almost hollow, and she looked away quickly, her stomach churning. She brushed it off, telling herself she was just being paranoid. But everything changed when they announced the harvest offering. The crowd parted, and Mr. Calloway's voice echoed over the quieting revelry. His eyes found Nate, and he gestured towards him. Emma's stomach dropped as Nate was pulled to the center of the square. At first, everyone thought it was part of the festivities. A joke, maybe, until the crowd grew solemn, faces turning grim. Emma's heart began to race. She caught sight of Abby, whose expression mirrored her own. confusion, and rising panic. They watched as Mr. Calloway spoke in low, rhythmic tones, his voice blending with the wind. From the murmuring crowd, words like sacrifice and blessing floated up. Nate's eyes widened in disbelief, and when he struggled, two men stepped forward to hold him. Panic erupted within Emma. She tried to push forward, but Tyler pulled her back. "We have to go," he whispered urgently, his face pale with realization. The next moments blurred together in terror. Emma, Tyler, and Abby were being shoved aside as Nate's screams echoed over the festival music. The smiling faces of Willow's End now looked grotesque in the lantern light, their eyes void of any emotion, but something ancient and unwavering. The blessings of the community, the bountiful harvests, the health of the livestock, they came at a cost, one that this town had paid willingly for generations, and now Nate was to be that cost. Emma grabbed Abby's hand and Tyler was already ahead of them. Pushing his way through the crowd, they tore through the town square, sprinting past startled children and horrified onlookers. The woods were their only option. The darkness enveloped them as they ran. Branches whipped against their faces. The uneven ground threatened to trip them with every step. The sound of their panting mixed with the far-off chanting of the townspeople, growing fainter with distance. Emma's lungs burned. But she didn't stop until the chanting was gone and only the sound of crickets surrounded them. They collapsed near a stream, gasping for air. Abby sobbed quietly, and Tyler just stared at the dark woods, his eyes hollow. We left him," Emma whispered, her voice breaking. There was nothing they could have done. They all knew it, but the guilt was like a vice, squeezing her chest. The sun was starting to rise when they finally moved again, stumbling towards the road, towards safety, or whatever passed for it now. The quaint charm of Willow's End was long gone, replaced by the sinister truth that lay beneath. Emma glanced back once, seeing the tops of the trees where the town lay hidden, and a shiver ran through her. It had been a perfect summer road trip until they had taken that wrong turn, until they had trusted smiling faces hiding monstrous intentions. They didn't stop until they were miles away, and the thought of the town, the harvest festival, and the blessings left them cold. It was a secret they'd carry forever, a reminder of what they had escaped and what they had lost. Story 3. The August sun warmed the wooden panels of the quaint rental, nestled between swaying pine trees and the sound of distant ocean waves. The place had seemed perfect when Sarah found it online. Its cozy kitchen, the sunlit porch overlooking a private path to the beach, and, most of all, the seclusion. She had eagerly booked it for her and Eric, longing for a break from the noise and busyness of their lives in the city. "You sure know how to pick 'em, Sarah," Eric said with a grin, dropping his duffel bag on the floral couch. Sarah smiled back, taking in the rustic charm of the place. Everything seemed just right, except for the faint sense of unease that prickled at her as soon as they walked in, a feeling she tried to brush off as a result of the recent stress at work. It started with small things. Sarah noticed her hairbrush wasn't where she left it, sitting instead on the edge of the bathroom sink. Eric's book, left on the porch, appeared at the kitchen table when neither of them had brought it back inside. They laughed it off at first, teasing each other for being forgetful in their attempt to unwind. But soon, the light-hearted jokes turned into uncomfortable glances. On the third night, Sarah woke suddenly. The room was dark, the only sound the gentle hum of the ceiling fan. But she felt it, an unsettling awareness, like eyes were on her even in the pitch black. She shifted closer to Eric, his deep breaths barely comforting her against the inexplicable anxiety gnawing at her. She lay awake until the first hint of dawn crept through the curtains, her heart pounding as if in anticipation of something. The next day, she decided to go for a walk to clear her head. Eric stayed behind to make breakfast. As she wandered down the sandy path toward the beach, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, her every step tracked by some unseen presence. When she returned, Eric was sitting at the table, staring at his phone, his face drained of color. "What's wrong?" she asked, rushing over. He didn't answer right away, just handed her the phone. On the screen was a link to a live streaming website. An open tab he said he'd found by accident when using the rental's tablet. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she saw the image on the screen. The two of them, sitting at the very table she now stood beside. The video was live, the timestamp proving it. In the corner of the screen, a view count ticked upward, hundreds of strangers watching them in real time. Sarah's eyes widened as she looked around the house, a chill rushing down her spine. "We have to get out of here, Eric," she whispered, her voice trembling. Eric nodded, but before they could even move, a muffled creak sounded from the hallway. Sarah's eyes darted toward the noise, and she realized with a sinking horror that they weren't alone. Panic set in as Eric grabbed her hand, and they bolted for the door, their footsteps echoing through the small house. Once outside, the fresh air did little to calm them. They ran to the car, fumbling for the keys, adrenaline making their hands shake. Behind them, Sarah thought she saw a shadow move past one of the windows as if someone was watching them leave, satisfied. The drive away from the house was silent, both of them too stunned to speak. Sarah's mind raced, piecing together every strange moment from their stay. The misplaced items, the feeling of being watched, the hidden cameras they hadn't even noticed. She felt violated, their private moments turned into entertainment for some faceless audience. "We have to tell someone," Eric finally said, his voice shaky. "The police, the rental company, everyone. They can't get away with this." Sarah nodded, her jaw clenched. She knew Eric was right. This wasn't over, not for them and not for whoever else might stay in that house. The romantic getaway that was supposed to be their escape had become a nightmare. But she was determined to turn her fear into action, to expose the people behind it and make sure no one else would ever have to feel the way they did in that moment, watched, vulnerable, and hunted.